My family arrived, at least most of my family arrived in North America during the late 1800s, early 1900s, so over 100 years ago, maybe about 110 years ago. Most of my family was from Romania. One branch actually came from Moldova, although that part of Moldova where they spoke Romanian. Of course, my family all spoke Yiddish as the first language, but to do business with their Christian neighbors, they had to know Romanian as well. And things were not great for the Jews of Romania 110 years ago. There were pogroms, especially in the northern part of the country, in places like Kishinev, and people were very poor. So in addition to physical oppression, there was real economic oppression as well. So my family wanted to get out of Romania. Most of them came out through the generosity of Baron de Hirsch, who was a Jewish philanthropist who had this idea that poor Jews ought to get back to the earth. They ought to get back to working the soil, that we've been removed from endeavors like agriculture. And so he financed Jews setting up agricultural communities all over the world. My family got the opportunity to go to Canada, and so it was about 110 years ago, and they arrived in Halifax, the first port, and then they went to Montreal, and they got on trains, and they went out to what was known in those days as the territory of Assiniboine. And there were three agricultural settlements in what is now the province of Saskatchewan. One was called Hirsch, named after Baron de Hirsch. Another one was called Edenbridge, which originally was Judenbroek, which meant Jewbridge. Now, my family was part of a group of approximately 150 families, lived even further north in a town called Lipton. And in the first year, they got there in the early summer, and the Hudson's Bay Company, which was the big general merchandise company in Canada in those days, was supposed to bring lumber. So the people could build houses. It never appeared, never came. But I remember talking to my grandmother, and I said, well, how did you survive? You can't be homeless. You cannot live out in the open. And what she said, well, we dug under the ground, lifted up the grass. This was what they built in essence was a sod dwelling. I went out there about 25 years ago. The University of Saskatchewan was doing a little bit of an archaeological study of this site. And there was a young man for the university who had a lot of information about what had happened there. And I noticed that in this graveyard, there was a young woman who was buried near the fence. Now, in our tradition, that means it's a suicide. She came here with her children and her husband, and he had to go back to Romania for some family emergency. And she was left in that small cabin all winter long with their children. And there's an expression that we use in Canada, it's called cabin fever. In the winter, when you're indoors too much, it's like being in prison. But can you imagine a young woman not having the company of adults with a bunch of kids in a small house, maybe 1 or 2 rooms? She went crazy, killed herself. The Canadian government wanted the Jews to be spread out. I think they gave 10 acres to everyone, free. 10 or maybe it was 15 acres, something like that. They would give it to you. Now, you had to have it cleared, or 50% cleared. All the trees had to be cut down, and it had to be cultivated within a year or 2. And then you could keep it. Now, what the Jews wanted to do is to set up like an agricultural community, like a moshav in Israel. They wanted like a kind of a little town, and maybe them sharing the land, sharing the equipment. But what the Canadian government was interested was to get the land settled. They wanted white people out there to take the land, especially from the Indians, to take it and settle it. And so they were more interested in everybody being sort of separated, living on their own pieces of land. And so they offered people an extra 10 acres if you would separate yourself from the rest of the group, move a little further out. And I've wondered over the years whether that woman and her husband had decided to move a little further away from the community to get the extra 10 acres. Had they made that calculation, it was a deadly calculation. Because when you separate yourself from the community, you endanger yourself. Had this woman lived near or nearer the other Jewish women, they could have checked on her, knocked on her door saying, "We haven't seen you for a while. How are you? Maybe we can watch your children for a little bit. Would you like to come over for a cup of tea or something?" I suspect that they had moved away a little bit. And there's actually a warning in the Talmud. It says, "Al tifrosh min hatzibur," do not separate yourself from the community. And I would add, even for an extra 10 acres of land.